Before I go any further and begin video 6, I want to pause and take stock of where we've been. In this series I've called Faith, Reason, and the Search for Truth. I've been intentional in how I've approached them. We spent the last 5 videos asking a simple question from different angles. What must be true if the worldview of materialism is true? Each video's discussion has followed its prior video with the intent of building on its predecessor's conclusions, each one leading towards this moment in our journey to truth. Hello, my name's Braden, and welcome to my channel. This series of videos I'm doing for 2026 is a breakdown of the arguments I made in my book I wrote titled An Atheist Delusion. It isn't a book about all atheists or atheism itself. It's about one atheist in particular, world-renowned atheist and evolutionary biologist, Richard Dawkins. I wrote my book in response to his anti-theist, anti-Christ book, The God Delusion, from my Latter-day Saint perspective. This picture illustrates what we've covered in this series so far. In videos 1 through 3, I did my best to follow a proper philosophical sequence of reasoning by considering what materialism's worldview claims, and then asking those questions that naturally follow from what materialism's claims try to explain. In video 4, we learned that morality is more than a choice based on a casual, subjective, or optional liking. I showed that it's not just preference. It is instead driven by necessity, a requirement, or a strong non-negotiable priority. It signifies a step up from a desire or turning a nice-to-have into a must-have that dictates behavior. We learn that morality is real and driven by must-have, a rule or a law that dictates specific behaviors. In video 5, I introduced identity, meaning, and agency into the discussion. And in today's video, video 6, we'll be answering the question, can identity, meaning, purpose, agency, and consciousness be explained by matter or chemistry alone? And in my next video, video 7, we'll be asking, if not, what follows? Agency, accountability, moral structure? As you'll soon see, video 6 is the capstone critique of materialism, not yet the moral fallout. In the previous 5 videos, I've been asking whether the worldview of materialism can survive its own logic. In other words, I've been and am still internally pressure testing materialism. I've been following its own claims to their logical consequences. In doing so, I found that those consequences conflict with lived human realities, meaning, purpose, agency, moral obligation, and consciousness. As a result, the worldview of materialism falls on its own terms. In short, materialism collapses under its own weight. Collapse comes first, consequence comes next. But I'm getting ahead of myself. One of the questions I asked back in video 1 was what counts as evidence or proof of materialism being the only answer for our existence and what's real, which is one of materialism's claims. In following the reasoning chain behind this claim, we discovered that materialism quietly excludes entry of entire categories of human experience, such as moral knowledge, meaning, and conscious awareness, well before the discussion even begins. We also uncovered the hidden rules that materialists often impose on questioners like myself, and in an effort to restrict what one can bring into the debate. Now, the critics' objection to my using reason in this way will be that reason belongs to science. You're stealing reason and weaponizing it against materialism. But that isn't true. I'm simply exposing the hidden assumptions and asking what must be true for science itself to work. I'm not saying that materialists don't use reason. What I'm saying is that materialism cannot ground the very reasoning it relies on. That distinction is everything. The kind of reason I'm talking about is not in the scientific method, the laboratory technique, the data analysis, or in the hypothesis testing. Those are inside the science. Instead, the reason I'm talking about represents something deeper. It's the ability to ask normative questions. It's the ability to say this explanation succeeds and this one fails. It's the authority to judge consistency, contradiction, implication, and coherence. And that's not instrumental reason. That's philosophical reason. And crucially, materialism uses reason for sure, but it cannot explain why reason should be trusted. The fact is, reason stands outside materialism. Materialism says reason is reducible to chemistry and neural firings alone, but reason itself says, if that's true, then one's belief in materialism is just another adaptive output and not something one is rationally justified in holding. And that, my friend, is the collapse. Reason doesn't belong inside materialism. It's meant to interrogate materialism from the outside. The kind of reasoning I'm talking about here isn't anti-science. It's the kind that simply refuses to pass through a gate that excludes truth-relevant categories. And that's exactly the argument I've been making throughout these first 5 videos. I don't deny that scientists reason together. What I'm asking is what gives reason any authority? Notice that reason isn't holding a weapon. Reason isn't labeled religion. Reason isn't moralizing. Reason, like this personified reason in this picture, is just standing there, holding the line. Its calmness is disarming and philosophically honest. Some scientists want to blur the distinction between reason and grounding reason. But the question isn't whether we reason or not. It's why reason should be trusted at all, if materialism is true. In video 2, I asked, is science neutral? And saw that science itself, in fact, does not speak. Only scientists do. They are the ones interpreting the data through their prior worldview commitments, or I should say, through their current materialistic biased glasses. In video 3, I asked, is morality real? I asked this because morality creates a pressure point that materialism cannot avoid. That pressure being either morality is an illusion, a useful fiction produced by survival pressures, or it's a real feature of the world's reality. And by diving deeper with reflective questions like this, we learn that this reflective questioning forces materialism into a corner. In video 4, we pressure tested materialism by asking, can it actually support morality without religious support? And found that such experiences as moral outrage, evil, and injustice don't sit comfortably inside a worldview that says everything is ultimately just chemistry. And so the cracks began to show. The core tension we discussed in video 5 was brought up by asking the unavoidable question, if morality is real, what are we then, really? Here's the problem. Materialism faces with such questions. Materialism keeps insisting this is all chemistry, but our lived experience keeps contradicting that claim. We discovered that identity, agency, purpose, and consciousness have emerged, not as religious claims or as optional add-ons, but as unavoidable realities. We didn't arrive at this contradiction emotionally or through preaching. We arrived at it logically by using honest reasoning. We simply asked one simple question over and over. If you really believe this, then how do you explain that? By asking that kind of question consistently, we weren't attacking materialism. It simply collapses under its own admissions. Another point needs to be made here. Meaning must be about something. Meaning is not just a feeling in the brain. It's directed. And when we say something matters, we are saying it matters in reference to a standard beyond our own personal preference. If meaning were nothing more than private neural activity, then nothing could be truly meaningful. It would be only temporarily stimulating and untrustworthy. Yet, we find that people sacrifice, suffer, and even die for meaning, which is something no one does for mere chemical comfort or survival. As I said, meaning must be about something. Next is consciousness, the courtroom problem. Dawkins describes consciousness as an evolutionary byproduct. But consciousness doesn't merely experience, it judges. In other words, we reflect, we regret, we say, I shouldn't have done that. And yet we know that chemistry should. Neurons fire, but neurons don't hold court over actions. So I must ask myself this, if consciousness is just chemistry, why does it judge chemistry the way it does? Why does it this faculty called conscience, stand above impulse rather than submit to it? I found that materialism cannot answer that question without contradicting itself. Chemistry denies shoulds and should nots. If consciousness were merely chemical activity, it would not hold court over our actions rather than simply accompanying them. And that's because consciousness is not just a passive feature of our wet brains' unguided neural firings. If it were, it wouldn't make judgments. The fact is, we reflect, we evaluate, we regularly say, I should not have done that, or you shouldn't have done that, or they shouldn't be doing that. Dawkins himself admits consciousness is real, but materialism offers no explanation for why consciousness has authority rather than merely sensation. So as I said, here's where materialism collapses under its own weight. It does so from critical reasoning. If materialism is true, then meaning doesn't really matter. Purpose is imaginary, and moral obligation is an illusion, and conscious responsibility is accidental. And yet, none of us live as though any of that is true. Mr. Dawkins's first admission regarding materialism was regarding moral realism. Richard Dawkins openly acknowledged that morality feels real. In other words, we already live as though meaning matters. And like I said, materialism collapses the moment meaning is admitted as being real. Dawkins writes in his book, The God Delusion, and I quote, "We humans have moral feelings, a sense of right and wrong," end quote. This seems to confirm what the Apostle John taught. His teaching on this feature of mankind's reality is recorded in the book of John from the Holy Bible. It's John chapter 1, verse 9, and I quote, "Christ is the true light, which lighteth every man that cometh into the world," end quote. I love this picture. I made it in the way I did in order to illustrate visually the concept or principle John is speaking of here. It's called our conscience, so you can better understand what I'm going to say next. In Latter-day Saint theology, we call this concept of conscience the light of Christ. It's given as a spiritual gift to every person who has ever come to live on this earth or will ever live here as part of our very nature and makeup. This divine force within us includes influence, energy, power, and manifestations of the invisible essence called spirit. This force is expanded upon by the prophet Moroni from the Book of Mormon. In the Book of Moroni, which is at the end of the Book of Mormon, Moroni teaches, "For behold, the Spirit, or the light, of Christ is given to every man, that he may know good from evil. Wherefore I show unto you the way to judge. For everything which inviteth to do good and to persuade to believe in Christ is sent forth by this power and gift of Christ, this light of Christ. Wherefore ye may know with a perfect knowledge it is of God." See chapter 7, verse 16. And in the revelations that were given to the prophet Joseph Smith, in particular the one found in the Doctrine and Covenants, section 88, verses 46, the Lord taught Joseph, and I quote, "And the Spirit, or the light of Christ, giveth light to every man that cometh into the world. And this Spirit enlighteneth every man through the world, that hearkeneth to the voice of the Spirit." End of quote. Each of us knows that all of us has a conscience reminding us of what's right and what's wrong. Each of us judge actions as better or worse. Richard Dawkins even wrote in his book, The God Delusion, and I quote, "We humans have moral feelings, a sense of right and wrong." End of quote. To me, Dawkins is affirming here what the prophets and apostles have taught about human beings having feelings of judgments. Materialism says those feelings of judgments are just evolutionary illusions. Yet in contradiction to this dogma of materialism, Dr. Dawkins routinely speaks as though injustice is actually wrong, not merely inconvenient. I'm not mocking evolution here. Please note that I'm not trying to caricature Darwin. I'm simply exposing a philosophical tension here. Richard condemns cruelty. He condemns abuse. He condemns harm, not as survival disadvantages, but as actual violations. I ask you, violations to or of what? You don't speak that way about illusions, do we? No, we don't. Each of us live as though these things are real, and that's because they are. And if they are real, then the universe is not what materialism says it is. Period. Next comes progress without purpose. When Dawkins speaks of progress, he uses words like better, worse, advance, and regress. But he also writes, the universe we observe has precisely the properties we should expect if there is at the bottom no design, no purpose, nothing but blind, pitiless indifference. See this in his book, River Out of Eden. Do you see the contradiction here, though? The contradiction here is that you don't get better or worse from blind processes alone. Richard says there's no design, no purpose from materialism's perspective of reality, which is born out of the dogma of evolution's survival of the fittest tenet. Survival may explain continuation, but it cannot explain improvement, purpose, and progress. Progress requires a standard for improvement to happen. Materialism denies any standard beyond survival, and yet it lives as though standards are real. I could go on and on about this contradiction, but let's go ahead now and go on to the next contradiction. Next is meaning isn't optional. Materialism says meaning is invented. No one lives that way, though. People sacrifice for meaning, they suffer for meaning, and they die for meaning. Parents don't raise their children as evolutionary experiments. We judge lives as fulfilled or wasted. We even mourn when meaning is destroyed. Right? Here's what we would have to give up if we were to be consistent in what materialism says. It demands that we say, meaning doesn't really matter. Purpose is imaginary. Moral obligation, identity, and even love, if we are honest, has to be reduced to chemistry only. These are forces that don't truly bind, obligate, or endure. And so reason resolves the contradiction, right? Not by force, but by clarity. And that's because, as I said, no one lives this way, including Dawkins. As we ask the right questions, direction is revealed. You can't have progress without purpose. Materialism denies design and purpose. Without purpose, direction collapses. But direction exists. Materialism didn't create the path, it obscured it. Meaning governs life. It forces the viewer to confront this reality, and I quote, no one treats death as meaningless. No one stands at a graveside and says, well, once again, chemistry rearranged, and blind indifference has done its work. Materialism says meaning is invented, but again, no one lives that way. What kind of world must this be for this to matter? Materialism has a cost, and the cost is existential. If materialism is true, what must we give up? When meaning is shattered, we don't shrug, we mourn. The bottom line here is that if meaning were optional, none of this would make any sense. Here's the question materialism can't escape. If materialism is true, what must we give up? And are we actually willing to give it up? The life loss represented in this stone relief mattered. The soldier's sacrifice mattered. If meaning were optional, then mourning would be irrational. But it isn't. Survival, progress, standards, purpose, and the value of a human life all have meaning. That's not sentimentality. That's existential evidence. Meaning governs life and death. If meaning was just an invention of the wet brain, why does it bind us so deeply? Materialism says life is chemistry, death is chemistry, and survival is the only metric. But at a graveside, no one is thinking about gene propagation. They are thinking about a promise broken by death, a role that mattered, a story interrupted, a love that still binds, and that's not survival language, that's theological language. That's purpose language. That's moral language. If meaning were invented, grief would be irrational, but grief feels obligatory. We feel that something real has been lost. It's not just a biological organism, it's a person, and that word person carries metaphysical weight. Our lived reality presupposes meaning, and as I said, if meaning is real, materialism cannot be the full story. That's not emotional manipulation, that's existential observation. Materialism, in its strictest form, holds that reality consists solely of matter and energy. It attests that all phenomena are ultimately reducible to physical processes, and that there is no objective teleology, normativity, or intrinsic value. From within that framework, materialism says that the following cannot exist as realities. only as experiences or behaviors. Meaning, it's nothing more than subjective projection. Purpose, it's nothing more than adaptive behavior. Moral obligation, it's nothing more than social conditioning. Love, it's nothing more than neurochemical bonding plus evolutionary advantage. And identity, it's nothing more than an illusion. What I'm saying is real. Materialists say it's not. They say love exists, but it's just explained by biology. And they're right about explanation, but they're wrong about status. The key is to clarify what kind of love I mean. Under materialism, love equals chemical attachment. Love has no moral authority. Love has no obligation. Love cannot ground sacrifice, fidelity, or ought and should. Therefore, materialism says moral obligation and even love must be treated as illusions. What reason does here is that it forces each of us to choose between worldview's claim and our own lived reality. Nobody lives as if their child's or husband's life has no real value, or that betrayal is merely a chemical event, and love is interchangeable with neural stimulation, and sacrifice is just misfiring biology at play. The truth is we can't ignore our lives' reality, can we? World-renowned Northern Irish mathematician, bioethicist, and lay theologian, Mr. John Lennox, often debated atheist Richard Dawkins, and was often asked something along this line: how do you know your wife loves you? And he would respond along these lines. He says that if someone tried to explain his wife's love for him purely in scientific terms, by describing brain chemistry, neural firings, hormone levels, or evolutionary advantage alone, they would be missing the point entirely. Yes, all of those physical processes may be present, but they are not what love is. He explains that if his wife were to say to him, "Honey, I love you," and someone replied, "No, you don't. What's really happening is oxytocin, dopamine, and survival biology," that explanation would not invalidate love, but it would fail to explain it. Then Lennox makes the crucial move here. He explains that the mechanism of love is not the same as explaining the meaning of love. To reduce love to chemistry alone would be like saying that even though we can analyze the ink and paper of a letter, the message itself is still an illusion. In short, science describes how love is expressed, but it does not explain why it matters, what it means, or why it carries obligation, loyalty, sacrifice, and trust. If love were nothing more than chemistry, then betrayal would be no more significant than a chemical misfire, and fidelity would have no real moral weight. Yet, as I just said, no one actually lives that way, including materialists. No one lives as if fidelity and infidelity and betrayal are equal. I believe this simple illustration makes my point very clear and illustrates where materialism falls apart. So once again, I return to the same question. If materialism is true, what must we give up? And are we actually willing to give it up? Here's another question I would ask the materialist, which, in my view, collapses everything. It's a single question that does more work than volumes of philosophy. And I quote, "If materialism were true so that no one owes us anything, why does injustice feel like a violation and not a preference that dictates all other choices?" You see, this reaction of feeling violated because justice itself has been violated causes one to have innate feelings of justice stir within them, which means it's real. But it only makes sense if something real has been broken. And that's where the philosophical turn becomes existential. If injustice is real, someone is responsible. This light of Christ within us, our conscience, asks us to ask ourselves, what if I'm responsible for my actions? That means I am my own agent. And if I'm an agent who's accountable, then there must be a moral grounding tied to this. You should be realizing by now that our journey that I'm taking you on is narrowing. It's our own betrayal, our own dishonesty, our own failure, our own choices that reveal there's a moral ground that we are accountable to. Personal agency is not an abstraction. Coming to the realization that personal choice through moral agency and the truth that I did this or that shows that reason can be used rightly or wrongly. Once you admit that, even quietly, materialism is finished. And this is, in fact, what has happened as we followed the ancient stepping stones that were always there, but were hidden under the dust and dirt of time and a worldview that blinded us to them. Thank goodness we're now using the process of reason and questions. What I've found by asking the kinds of questions we've been asking ourselves is that most people respond by saying something like, if it's true that materialism is true, and I'm not saying that it is, then yes, meaning doesn't really matter. Purpose is imaginary, and moral obligation is an illusion. But I don't actually believe that. To me, that's not rebellion, my friend. That's honesty. The idea that moral obligation can exist in a mindless universe hasn't withstood reason's inquiries here. And once this kind of honesty settles in, a new, even more powerful and revealing question emerges naturally. And that question is, if meaning isn't optional and if moral obligation isn't imaginary, then we are most definitely left with an unveiled reality, being accountable. And if being accountable is real, then one must ask themselves, with whom or with what are we accountable to? Before you answer that, know that this isn't a religious leap. It is simply the next logical step. Now, please understand, I'm not going to get religious on you here. This topic and journey has existed for millennia. They're ancient. Man has been discussing, arguing, and teaching this stuff for a very, very long time. In fact, long before modern philosophy, Scripture framed this exact insight I've been unfolding for you, not as doctrine, but as moral reality. It's found in the book of Romans, chapter 2, verses 14 through 16. Here's what it says. For when the Gentiles, which have not the law, meaning the law of Moses, do by nature the things contained in the law, these having not the law are a law unto themselves, which shows the work of the law written in their hearts, their conscience also bearing witness, and their thoughts, the meanwhile, or better stated, and their thoughts in the meantime, were accusing, or else excusing one another. In the day when God shall judge the secrets of men by Jesus Christ, according to my gospel. So, this is saying that even non-believers who don't believe or follow the law of Moses, they still have a conscience telling them what's right and what's wrong, which is what I've been saying. They may even keep some of the law unknowingly, due to their conscience in their heart, but they do so not knowing they're part of the law that they chose to follow. This light, this conscience, reveals that they and all the rest of us are accountable. The law written in the hearts of all men did not end in Moses's or Paul's time. It persists even today. It crosses all time. It's across all cultures. It even crosses all generations. Conscience is universal. Some respond to it, some suppress it. Reason, however, sees it. Modern religious leaders have been teaching this journey to truth, led by our conscience, to help all of us understand that all of us have this light, this law written in our hearts, but many of us do not know it or understand what it is or where it comes from. But having taken this journey to truth thus far, we now know we're accountable for our own actions as an agent unto ourselves. We've learned that meaning in this life is real. Our journey has landed us on this stepping stone that led us to the base of accountability, which says, our conscience, the very light of Christ, is written in all of us, in all mankind's hearts. This light, this law, makes it so every one of us knows good from evil as a starting point. In short, we are accountable for our actions and behaviors. But what we do with this reality, whether we heed it or we set it aside, matters. This light lets us know that materialism's worldview is counter to reality. Reason tells us that if this law, this sense of justice, this light of Christ that's in each of us is telling us what is right and wrong, then that knowing, that telling is real. And that accountability is naturally what follows. And if accountability is real, then materialism has conceded more than it can sustain. Whether you accept my claims here or not, I would still have you notice what they assert. They assert that consciousness is fundamental. Meaning is not invented. Moral agency is real, and as we've seen, materialism cannot carry these realities in itself. You know it, and I know it, and that's because we know all human beings live by them every day. The points I've made during our conversations in these first 6 videos regarding materialism have revealed that materialism itself doesn't collapse because of theology or religion. It collapses because it can't account for the very things its defenders try to say they come from. I'm speaking, of course, of meaning, purpose, agency, morality, and identity, moral outrage, rational judgment, meaningful lives, conscious responsibility, and a feeling of being accountable all die when viewed from materialism's worldview glasses. Materialists even say the law of justice that's been written on the hearts of every human being who has ever lived on this earth and will ever live on it is just something that man constructed over tens of thousands of years. They say that it is invented or an illusion. But as we've discovered, life reveals that these features of truth are real and all lead to accountability. Once these realities are admitted, even implicitly, materialism can no longer stand. And that, my friend, brings us to the next unavoidable question. If we are, in fact, moral agents, which all of these features of reality are pointing to, then having feelings of real accountability, having a sense of justice, and this feeling of judgments in our hearts makes us ask ourselves, are we accountable to something beyond ourselves? In other words, if agency is real and not an illusion, then what kind of reality has to exist for this principle, this feature of reality to make any sense at all? And here's another question that has to be asked. Where does agency fit in this sequential uncovering of reality? Accountability does not require coercion. It does not require force. It only requires authority, something that grounds why ought or should has meaning in the first place. These are words each of us use throughout our daily lives. This is where materialism falls silent. We don't merely experience impulses. We evaluate them. We don't just act. We judge our actions. We say things like, I shouldn't have done that. I ought to do better next time. And that language only makes sense if we are moral agents, beings capable of choice, responsibility, and self-governance. Chemistry doesn't deliberate. Molecules don't weigh reasons. Blind processes don't issue obligations. These realities are revealed because we live as though our choices matter, our actions carry weight, and our decisions are accountable. Notice something here. Agency only makes sense where there is opposition. Remove the contraries of opposition, and you remove choice. Agency itself goes away when you remove the opposition. In the next video, video 7, we'll take the next step, not by preaching, but by asking the question materialism can't answer. If agency, meaning, and moral obligation are real, what kind of reality must exist for them to make sense? This image shown here shows the continuity of agency. Mr. Reason wasn't dragged to the halls of truth and accountability. He hasn't been converted to them yet either. He hasn't been overwhelmed. What he has done is observed, evaluated, entered, weighed contraries, and exercised choice. And now he opens the doors to further truth. That's agency in motion. Reason has arrived at the threshold of further light and knowledge. Not sentiment, not pressure, and not spectacle. Reason has willingly walked the journey with us, which has ultimately led him to the hall of accountability and enduring truth. Earlier, we saw reason stand between contraries, where he proved them by making sound, reasonable judgments. Reason made his choices. He's now opening the door to more light and truth. This next step is a rational step. Notice that the light of truth doesn't coerce reason. It corresponds to and resides within him. When agency opens its doors, truth responds with further light and knowledge. And we found being honest with ourselves is what has brought us here. This leads us directly to what video 7 will address, the God hypothesis. In video 6 of Faith, Reason, and the Search for Truth, we've reached the capstone critique of materialism. For 6 videos, we've asked a simple but disciplined question. What must be true if materialism is true? We followed its claims wherever they led us. We pressure tested all of its assumptions. We examined morality, meaning, identity, agency, purpose, and consciousness, not from religious claims perspectives, but as lived realities. And what we discovered is that materialism does not collapse because of theology. It collapses because it cannot account for the very realities its defenders rely upon. We don't merely experience impulses, we evaluate them. We don't merely act, we judge our actions. We speak in the language of ought nots and should nots, responsibility and accountability. Those realities are not illusions. We live by them every day. In this episode, video 6, we explored why reasons stand outside of materialism, why moral obligation cannot be reduced to chemistry, why meaning is not optional, why agency requires opposition, and why accountability follows naturally from moral realism. This is not a religious leap, it is a philosophical unfolding, and it leads us directly to the next unavoidable question. If agency, meaning, and moral obligation are real, what kind of reality must exist for them to make sense? That is the question video 7 will begin to answer. While we wait for video 7 to go live, I would have you ask yourself this. Does the collapse of materialism point us towards explanation rather than illusion? Until next time, I wish you continued success. Goodbye. God bless. Love you.